When was the last time you went out and got your mail? Yesterday? Was there anything worth opening in it? There may have been mail in your mailbox, but maybe there wasn't anything worth opening in it. You have this experience too? I love that when I get my mail and I walk back into the house, I walk right by my trash can. It's helpful, right? Because a lot of times you need it right then. What you get in the mail, right, has different levels of importance, doesn't it? Right? It has very different levels of importance. When you get junk mail, it can go right in the trash can, right? But if you get an invitation to something, let's say like a wedding, right, or pretty soon here, there's going to be a bunch of graduation announcements in your mailbox, right, or wedding invitations coming up this summer. But that's also a little bit different than if you get an invitation because you're being summoned to court. That didn't happen to me this week, thankfully. But we take those things with different levels of seriousness, right? We think about them or we don't think about them based on what it is, right? How many times have you toiled over reading very carefully the new offer that you've received to put new windows in your house again? How many of you have gotten that one? No offense to Anderson or anybody else, but I'm good. Thank you, right? The importance of the invitation that we get rises or falls in conjunction with just what we're being invited to, right? Invited to another company to spray your house for insects doesn't have the same ring to it as, right, as your daughter's wedding invitation that came in the mail, right? Likely you're the one that helped send those out, but still, it just doesn't have the same power. It's a very different sized story. And as we come to Palm Sunday and Jesus entering Jerusalem, there's a lot of different stories that are happening all at once. There's a lot of different perspectives on what the story is really all about. Why it is that Jesus is coming into Jerusalem riding on a donkey. Why are the people shouting, Hosanna? Oh, that's right, all the kids left. Thank you. Right? But the reality is, and this is the phrase that I want to haunt you this week. It's Holy Week, and so I want this phrase to haunt you during this week. This is the question that I want to stay with you this week. Are we inviting Jesus into our story, or does Jesus invite us into his? Do you see the difference? Are we inviting Jesus into our story, or are we invited into his? We all inhabit stories. We all inhabit stories, and the reality is that these stories that we inhabit really resonate with what we tell ourselves about what's really going on. Okay? So, if you look at John 11:45 to 12:11, we're going to look at the stories we inhabit, and I'm going to have them advance my slides for me, see if they can anticipate where I'm going, right? Our clicker is deciding to not. The stories we inhabit. So as we look at John 11:45 to 12:11, we see some of the context of what is happening all right before Jesus enters Jerusalem. And as we think about that, we realize there's a lot of different things going on. There's a lot of different things happening. Okay? So look with me at John 11:45. We're going to start in first with the chief priests and the Pharisees. What's the story that they are inhabiting? It says, Many of the Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary, had seen what he did, believed in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. Tattletales. So the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered the council and said, "What are we to do? For this man performs many signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation." So consider for a second the story that the chief priests and the Pharisees are inhabiting. What do they really think life is about? Because when Jesus comes on the scene, it is easy to miss the story that he's inviting us into because of the stories that we ourselves are wanting to live out. Does that make sense? We miss the story that Jesus is inviting us into because of the grip that we have on the stories that we really think we should be able to live out. The chief priests and the Pharisees are no different here. What are they seeing? What are they understanding? Right? They're seeing him do these signs and miracles. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him. And we're thinking, woohoo, that's what we want. And they're thinking, uh-oh. If everybody goes and believes in him, we're going to have unrest. The Romans are going to come, and they're going to take away our place in our nation. See, the chief priests and the Pharisees were inhabiting a very delicate story in light of Roman occupation and trying to live under the radar and be careful, but also still preserve their way of life. Now, that's not bad in and of itself, but as we're going to see, it's just too darn small. It's too darn small of a story to live in. What story you are open to from God decides how large your story can actually get. And when Jesus comes along, you do an analysis just like you do when you're coming back, walking up the driveway from your mailbox. Is this invitation something worth keeping? Invitation to a sale? Invitation to new windows? Invitation to less ants in your house? Or invitation to a life that you simply cannot get anywhere else but Jesus? Do you see the difference? So a lot of times we inhabit a story that we think is so big and is really quite small. The chief priests and the Pharisees plan to arrest and kill Jesus when he comes to Jerusalem for the Passover feast. That's their intent. Because their story is threatened. Their fear dictates what they can understand and what they miss. We can miss God's much more to come, bigger story when we let jealousy or anxiety rule in our hearts. How many of you know that's true? You miss God so much more if you let jealousy, as the Pharisees did, or anxiety, as the Pharisees did, rule your heart. It tells you what story you can accept from Jesus or what you can't if that's the thing ruling your heart. So the stories we inhabit can make us miss God's much more story. Let's move on to Caiaphas, John 11:49-54. Listen here. But one of them, Caiaphas, who was the chief priest that year, said to them, "You know nothing at all, nor do you understand that it is better for you that one man should die for the people, not that the whole nation should perish." And he did not say this of his own accord, but being the high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation, and not for the nation only, but also to gather into one the children of God who are scattered abroad. So from that day on, they made plans to put him to death. Jesus, therefore, no longer walked openly among the Jews, but went from there to the region near the wilderness, to a town called Ephraim, and there he stayed with his disciples. I want you to think about Caiaphas here for a second. The Pharisees are wrestling with this. They're dealing with this. They're trying to figure out what they should do. And Caiaphas, who's the chief priest, the one who would walk in the room and they would all respect what he'd have to say. He is the story definer for them. Okay? He would be their authority. He's the one that carries the most weight. And he says to them, "You know nothing at all." That is dripping with irony, by the way. Because Caiaphas is going to go on to say, like, you don't know anything, right? It's going to be better that one man dies for the nation, and then we get to keep all of our small little stories and stay living in this whole thing. Like, it's better for one to die for the nation than for all of us to, die and that be... Do you see how ironic that is? He doesn't even know the greatness of the story that he's telling everyone. Boy, I wish I didn't see myself in Caiaphas so much. Do I understand the greatness of the story that I tell people? Do I understand its bigness, its greatness, its glory, its beauty? Do I understand what it is for one man, the God-man, to come to earth and die to give people relationship with the God of the universe? Do I get that? Or is my life just as ironic? That I would say it and celebrate it, but not really take it in. That I could say the right theology. That I could even say, like what Caiaphas says, he understood something that he didn't understand. How amazing is that? That we can understand something that we don't fully understand. He prophesied more than he knew. You know nothing at all. He has no idea how right he is. All he could focus on, even in being the instrument that God would use to bring forward this profound prophecy, all he could focus on was the immediate, the small story that he was living out. Again, are we going to invite Jesus into our small story? Or are we going to let him invite us into his? He was part of a bigger story and he didn't even know it. He thought in that room he was the main character. That's why you say something like, y'all don't know anything at all. When you walk in and you think you're the main character in the room, right? Lord, help us, right? We can miss God's so much more to come, bigger story, when the pride of thinking we already know all there is to know reinforces the smallness of our story. Caiaphas thought he knew all there was to know. It's a challenge to all of us, isn't it? Especially those of you who've studied the Bible your whole life. We can think we know all there is to know, and we miss God's bigger story that he is inviting us into. And we miss it because we think we already know it. So can I challenge you this week? As you go into Good Friday and Easter Sunday, this Holy Week, can you go in with different eyes, fresh eyes, to say, you know what? I don't know this story nearly as well as I ought to know it, because this story, if I actually believed it, would light my life on fire and change it to a bigger story. Right? Can I challenge you to do that this week? I'm going to try and do that this week. Because it doesn't matter how many times you've read this story. It doesn't matter how many times you've seen a Good Friday service. It doesn't matter. It matters that we continue to let God rewrite the story that we think is the big deal. That's what matters. Caiaphas missed it too. Think about all that was happening in light of the Passover. The excitement that was. John 11:55-57. The Passover excitement. Now the Passover of the Jews, verse 55, was at hand. And many went up from the from the country to Jerusalem before the Passover to purify themselves. So think all the surrounding areas, all the Jews coming to Jerusalem, right? Kind of disrupting. They were looking for Jesus, verse 56, and saying to one another as they stood in the temple, "What do you think? That he will not come to the feast at all?" Now the chief priests and the Pharisees had given orders that if anyone knew where he was, they should let him know so that they might arrest him. It's funny, the Pharisees, they both think that their story is bigger, but they intuitively understand that Jesus' story is threatening. You see that? They think their story is bigger and more important, and therefore they think that Jesus' story is threatening to them. So arrest him on the spot. But think for just a second. People are gathered for Passover. How big was the story of Passover to them? That was a big deal, right? There's lambs bleeding in the streets, right? Bleating, not bleeding yet, in the streets, right? Select him, bring him home, make him your pet, do all the Passover stuff. And they're getting ready to celebrate Passover. But I'm interested, especially this Passover, what story they were inhabiting. Was their story at that point more about the Passover that rescued them from their sins and the angel of death passed over them because they trusted? Or was it more about, what also happened at Passover? Deliverance from the Egyptians. That's really intriguing to me. They come in, they lay down the palm branches and say, "Hosanna," right? And what are they wanting? Save us from what? This is where the story that we inhabit is so important. What is the biggest thing that you want rescued from right now? The bigness or smallness of the story you're living out is going to give you an answer to that question. Because if I can't see the bigger story that God is up to, I'm going to be just like the folks here that are excited for Passover, because it might mean, is Jesus coming? Do you think he's going to come? You think he might come? Why do they want him to come? Because they want him to reenact Egypt being overthrown. That's what they want him to reenact. They don't necessarily see their need for him to reenact the Passover lamb rescuing them from a greater enemy. Do you see how that works? The story they are inhabiting is keeping them from seeing their greater need to be rescued. It's distracting them. It is a great story in Israel's history that God redeems them and rescues them from what? Ultimately. And that's the question. Can I put it this way? And I don't mean to be offensive, but we can miss God's much more bigger story when we consume God's goodness on the small and most immediate of our needs, without seeing and understanding that we have much greater and bigger needs. But because we are wrapped up in the here and now, this story, can I be kind and say, it is not a good idea to consume the bigness and glory of God's nature on who has control of the House of Representatives. Can I say that? Because I love you? Because that is too small of a story. It's too small of a story for what God, the God of the universe, is actually up to in each and every one of your stories. Don't make your story that small. It is important. I'm not saying it's not important. I'm saying it's too small. The reality of who Jesus is too big for that. It doesn't mean that it does not affect that. In fact, I think that it will affect who has control of this or that more if we're actually rightly living in his story rather than ours. Those things will happen as a result, as fruit of us actually being caught up in the bigger story that Jesus has for us. Understand that? It is amazing to me that we can consume on ourselves the glory and the grace of God on such small things. And when we do that, we might get the thing that we want in the smallness of our story, and we miss all the bigger things that God's really up to. And so, as we see this excitement in Passover, this excitement in leading up to Holy Week, right? We have to see. Here's another example. Right after this, the very next verses, right at the beginning of chapter 12, we're introduced to Mary and Judas. This is so fascinating. 6 days before the Passover, verse 1. Jesus, therefore, came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. So they gave him a dinner there, and Martha served, and Lazarus was one of those reclining at the table. Mary, therefore, took a pound of expensive ointment made from pure nard and anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair. The house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume, but Judas Iscariot, one of the disciples, who was about to betray him, said, "Why was this ointment not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor?" And he said this, not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. And having charge over the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put in it. And Jesus says, "Leave her alone, so that she may keep it for the day of my burial. For the poor you will always have with you, but you will not always have me." By now you can see the stories that these characters are living out in living color and smell. Mary anoints and Judas is annoyed. Why is Judas annoyed? Because, well, you could have sold that, and that's, like a year's wages, and you could have used that money to help the poor. No, why is Judas offended? Judas is offended because of the smallness of his story. He's offended because he thinks his story is really, really big and is really, really small. Judas is annoyed by Mary's anointing of Jesus because it doesn't fit his story. It doesn't fit. And with every coin he takes out of that money bag for himself, he reinforces that story. You know why he's taking that money, coin after coin, out of the money bag? Because he's trying to make his story worth more than it is. Because it's not worth very much, and he knows it. Because he sees 3 years' wages wasted on Jesus' feet. Wasted in the air, wasted in Mary's hair. That's what he sees. What does Mary see? Mary does not see any of that as a waste. Why? Because of the more valuable story in front of her, because of the more valuable person in front of her, because of the one who is worth absolutely everything. In this story, there's very few people who get it. Mary is one of them that gets it. Because she understands my story is not worth nearly as much as this man sitting here. However she got a year's worth of wages, I don't know. But she knew what it was worth. And she knew how much more important the story that she was being invited into was. Not because she was invited into it, but because of the one who invited her. Do you see that? Mary was functioning out of her adoration. Mary was functioning out of her understanding. Judas was functioning out of his unbelief, his anxiety. Mary is functioning out of a life and a story that's integrated. Judas is functioning out of a story that's indignant because Jesus' story does not line up with his. But the reality is, as much as we might want to give Judas a hard time here, we're more like him than we are unlike him, aren't we? If we're honest. It's easy to rail on that because that makes us feel like our story's bigger and better. You see how that works? Self-righteousness is a way to make my story bigger than it really is. Instead, we can see and take the warning that it is to see Judas go through all that he does. Do not let your story become so important to you that when Jesus' story comes along and says, you know what, you need to just follow me and jump in my story, that you can't do it. You see how that goes? Mary is functioning out of her understanding of who Jesus is. Of who Jesus is and the mission that he has. We can miss God's much more and more to come, bigger story when we redefine God's story for him. That's what Judas did. Mary accepted Jesus' story as it was and then responded to it. When we miss just how central Jesus is in his own story, it can cause us to do all sorts of crazy things. And then right after this, the next day, the large crowd that had come to the feast heard that Jesus was coming to Jerusalem. So they took branches of palm trees and went out to meet him, crying, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, even the King of Israel. And Jesus found a young donkey and sat on it, just as it was written. Fear not, O daughter of Zion. Behold, your king is coming, sitting on a donkey's colt. His disciples did not understand these things at first. But when Jesus was glorified, when they remembered that these things had been written about him, and had been done to him. The crowd that had been with him when he called Lazarus out of the tomb and raised him from the dead continued to bear witness. The reason the crowd went to meet him was that they heard that the sign had been done. So the Pharisees said to one another, you see that you are gaining nothing. Look, the world has gone after him. So the crowd comes in. And they take palm branches and cry out, Hosanna, save us. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, even the King of Israel. My question is, why were they praising Jesus? Were they praising Jesus because they felt like he fit into their story? Or were they praising Jesus because they wanted to fit into his? We'll praise something if we think it fits into our story. We'll claim Jesus if he fits in well to our Facebook or our Instagram feed. We'll claim Jesus if it makes for a nice Easter picture for our family. But will we claim him when his story demands more of us than we're willing to give? The disciples are all about to find out whether that's the case for them or not. And some of them aren't going to like the answer. But isn't that good of God? Jesus comes in and he sits himself down on a donkey in verse 14. They talk about counterintuitive. No, Jesus, you're supposed to be on a war horse and take this thing back for Israel. Sorry, I couldn't resist. That's what they're wanting. That's what they're thinking. The trouble with Jesus is that he's living out a completely different story than the rest of them. The trouble with Jesus is that he is the main character of a bigger story that we will miss if we insist on our smaller ones. He's bringing with him so much more than we can fathom. And Zechariah 9:9, I should have gotten it. Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout aloud, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king is coming on what? A donkey. Because it goes on to talk about how this king is going to defeat all the enemies. But how's he going to do that on a donkey? Donkey's not the right animal to ride into war. Unless he understands something completely different about the war that he's fighting. And he does. Do we? You have the confused disciples. They don't understand it at first, and then they eventually get it. And you see the crowd again. Verse 17 and 18. Why are they there? They're wanting to see another sign. This guy raised somebody from the dead. That does not calculate into my story. I need more information to see if I can fit it into my story. Instead of saying, I think I need to subscribe to a different story. The Pharisees finally conclude, we're gaining nothing. For the Pharisees, if you're only focused on the math, you'll never hear the music. Does that make sense? If you're only focused on the math, we're losing people. You'll never hear the music of the bigger and more beautiful thing that God is doing. If you're only focused on what you'll lose, you'll never see what you will really gain. For them, for the Pharisees, self-promotion and self-protection is never as satisfying as Christ-motivated self-denial. That's only true if we're living in the right story. So what do we do with this? What do we do with this? Our application, we're invited into a bigger story. We're invited into so much more. We all inhabit a story. What story are you and I inhabiting? What is happening when we trust Jesus is less about us inviting Jesus into our hearts, as it is Jesus giving us a new heart that begins to have the capacity to understand the so much moreness of the story that he's inviting us into. You see the difference? Be very careful of thinking, I'm going to invite Jesus into my heart, because you might be saying, I'm going to invite Jesus into the smallness of my story. And then you don't live a life big enough, and then you blame Jesus. Right? Because you think, well, he's let me down. No, you and I weren't living the right story. We did not forsake our own stories and follow him and be invited into his story. Again, it's not so much us inviting Jesus into the smallness of our story that left to ourselves is not going to be nearly as satisfying, but Jesus inviting us into the greatness of all that God is up to in him. So the question is the story that you are living in big enough? Is it big enough? Because if you define your life in the box of what you think, hope, and experience, no offense to any of us, but that is a really, really small story. And it leads to the second question. Is the story you're living actually satisfying? Because I think outside of us being invited into Jesus' story, no story is satisfying enough. It might provide temporary satisfaction, but it's not satisfying enough. So it leads us to the next question. Who's actually the one writing this story? Who's the one that gets to write this story? Because if we're writing our story, guess what? Everybody else is writing their own stories. You ever notice how those two kind of come into conflict? Other people's idea of how your life should go, or how my life should go, or how you think their life should go. That's because we're all squabbling over small stories. Because if you are the one that actually writes your own story, the next question is, who does your story depend on to come to its conclusion? I don't like the answer to that. Who does my story depend on to come to its conclusion if I'm the one writing the story? It depends on me. Talk about anxiety producing. That worries me just thinking about it. It should worry me more when I try and wrestle the pen out of God's hand. Who does this story depend on to come to its conclusion? Boy, that pen is way better suited to remain in God's hand, isn't it? Does he know how to get from the fall and the crisis in the plot to the resolution and conclusion? He knows how to take every single smaller story and weave it into a greater story. And isn't that gracious of him? And so, if we can reverse engineer it, we can say, how does the conclusion of this story that God is writing change the reality of where I'm really at? If I know that this is the greater, bigger picture of where God is leading the whole story of humanity, the whole story of his glory and worship for all time, the whole story of the gospel and what it's all about, if I know that that is where he's leading it all, how does that change right now the story that I'm inhabiting? The story that I'm in? There's so much more to come that God is inviting us into for his glory, for our good. He really is the kind of king who invites us into his story, into his victory. He is not a small and petty king. He is the king who comes in and says, I have this. Do you want to be a part of it? He's not the kind of king that says, boy, oh boy, I wish I could be part of your story. You don't want that kind of king. That kind of king is not worthy of worship. But the kind of king that comes in and invites you to be part of what he is up to, that is a king worth worshiping. Because he can bring it all the way to the conclusion. And on Sunday morning when we celebrate that, we are so glad. But on Friday night, when it looks like his story is over, we have to remember that. And everywhere in between in your and I's life. So, again, the question that I want to continue to graciously haunt you this week is, are you inviting Jesus into your story? Or does Jesus invite you into a completely different one? I'm going to invite our worship team to come up. And they're going to lead us, and we're going to wrestle with that question. But guess what? If you've lived out the smallness of your story too many times to count, the invitation into his story is always there. As long as you have breath in your lungs and a beat in your heart, that invitation is there. You can jump into the bigness of his story at any point. And if you need to talk to me about that, meet me at the back doors. I'd love to talk to you about that. How you can actually say, no, I want to be part of that story. Let's pray. God, forgive us of the smallness of our stories and help us to worship you for the bigness of yours. In Jesus' name, amen.